Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to direct you to a area in chapter 9. It's on page 380, and it's the training intensity uh, component that ACE speaks to. It's actually really pretty interesting and very helpful because they do explain it really well. And I have students that are confused about the concept of training intensity. And so ACE actually does a really good job of explaining what you do need to know and understand. And keep in mind that when all is said and done, in general, we are dealing with, as personal fitness trainers, we are dealing with the average, and I say the average person, my goodness, there's so many averages, but we want to understand that these generally are going to be individuals with little to no experience lifting weights, doing resistance training. And so it's really only when you start really doing, resistance training using some, serious resistance or weights or loads that this idea of training intensity can be really fully appreciated. But again, I want you to go into this understanding, and again, this is related to questions I get from students. Which is a higher intensity set. The general understanding is that the heavier the weight, the higher the intensity. Now, I'm not saying that's incorrect. But I will say this, that that's not the only way to measure intensity. That's why I wanted to go over this. It's because students have asked me, so if I go heavier and heavier, it's more intense, correct? And the answer is, well, yeah, if you're basing it on what you just did, if you're using 100 pounds and you can only do 3 reps and you hit failure at 3 reps, so 100 pounds for 3 reps, is that intense? Well, yeah, I guess so. What about 100 pounds? It's the same weight, but you can do it for 8 reps to failure. Which one is more intense? Well, if you're just going by the weight, then the 100 pounds means that your 3 rep set is as intense as your 8 rep set, right? You first started in September and you can only do 3. Now it's January and you can do 8 reps. I don't know, whatever the case is. Which one is more intense? And my answer is, I'm not really sure it matters a whole lot. But if you want to get an actual answer, the question is really going to be based on that point of fatigue. So you could see intensity as a measure of the total amount of resistance that you're using. So, for instance, and ACE gives you this explanation. Like I say, they did a good job. You have an individual doing a bench press, for instance, and they use 100 pounds and they get to that second rep, third rep, and they're able to do the third one. And then on that fourth one, they literally can't do it anymore. And that you get a little bit of resistance, and that's it. Boom, 4 reps, 100 pounds. Compare that 100 pounds with 4 reps with somebody using 75 pounds. Okay. So it's less weight, but instead of 4 reps, that individual is able to get 10 reps. Now, just like when you saw that first individual was just dying to get that fourth one, boom, fatigue, failure. Well, you have that same issue with this person using 75 pounds. They get to 8 reps. And just like when that other person was doing 3 and they get to 9, and then that 10th rep, oh, bam, they put it back. Which one was of higher intensity? This is sort of the question that we get asked quite often. Was the 100-pound 4 rep set more intense simply because it was 100 pounds than the 75 pounds, but still hit fatigue failure at 10 reps? Again, there you can see it. I can definitely understand somebody saying, well, it's definitely the 100 pounds because it was heavier. It was more intense because it was heavier. Okay, yeah, I can kind of agree with you on that. On the other hand, especially when it comes to personal fitness training, the average person, I could also see that perhaps maybe it was even more intense to do less weight but more repetitions, because now you not only have the type 2X fibers that have been fatigued within the first 3 to 4 repetitions, but now you have more muscle fiber that's needed. Maybe you didn't have the same level of high level contractility with the type 2X with the lighter weight, but you had maybe more muscle fibers were working, the sort of the range of muscle fibers, type 2X, type 2A as well. Well, does that make it more intense? I can see both sides, and that's basically what ACE is telling you. So two different applications in the area of muscular training. Some experts define it as the percentage of maximal resistance used in an exercise. So there's your, I'm using heavier weight, or I'm using a higher percentage of my max. So I'd have to know my max resistance, right? So training the percentage of maximal resistance used in an exercise, they would consider here 4 reps with 90 pounds to be higher intensity than 8 reps with 80 pounds. Why? Because 90 pounds is heavier than 80 pounds. Or let's say that both of these individuals, they have a 100-pound max single rep max load, right? So if I'm looking at percent of maximum load being used, 90 is a higher percent of max than 80. Therefore, it's of higher intensity. Again, I've got no issue with saying, yeah, I can understand that. Sure, from a purely, resistance or load perspective, absolutely 90 is more intense, even though it's fewer repetitions. On the other hand, as I go down the page, um, other experts define training intensity as the effort level achieved during. So they would consider 4 reps with 90 and 8 reps with 80 to be equal in training intensity. Why? Because technically, if I use 90 pounds with the first definition of intensity, um, I do 90 pounds, which is a certain percentage of my max, and I don't fatigue. So I do it for 3 reps instead of four. 2, 3, boom, it's 90 pounds. The person using 80 pounds, let's just say it's the same max weight. So now it's 80% of max versus 90% of max. They do it to failure, 7, and then they do 8, boom, which was more intense. Well, again, with the first way of thinking about it, the 90-pound set, even though it wasn't performed to failure, was of higher intensity because it was simply of higher percent of max, 1 rep max. 80 pound, even though that 80-pound set was done to failure, is not as high in intensity. So the second way of understanding it, which is the way we would do it in with the sort of the average client, is to see it not as the load, but as the exertion with respect to fatigue level at a certain rep range. So, in other words, irrespective of the weight, if I take the set to failure, irrespective of the repetitions, that would be the more intense, or that would be the higher level of intensity. Now, you know this because let's just say you're doing a warm-up set of bench presses, and let's say you're using 135 pounds. You could probably crank 12, maybe 15, 20 reps, boom, and you put it back. Well, okay, so it's 135 pounds. You could probably max 250, something like that. But let me ask you a question. What if you did that 135 and you kept going after 15 reps? What would happen at 20 reps? You would start to kind of be a little challenging and you'd start to feel a burn. What happens when you got to 25 reps or even more? Even though the weight is lighter, you can push it to a point of fatigue to where you are literally, I mean, it is blisteringly difficult. Maybe 20 reps, maybe 25. And by the time you get to 30 reps with a quote, relatively light weight, like I'm talking here, say it's 135, and you can crank that out pretty easy. You get to 30 and you're dying at 30. Well, did it matter that it took 30 reps to get there versus 10 reps? In this way of understanding it, the answer is no. It is a very high intensity set. Why? Because we're looking at effort level. And that's basically what ACE is saying. I'm probably going well beyond the necessary explanation. But again, the idea is that if you're going to see intensity as purely based on the maximum or the percent of 1 rep max on a particular exercise, I got no issue with that if that's the way you want to do it. If you're a power lifter, that's critically important. In fact, that is going to be the variable that we use, right? Is percent of one rep max. On the other hand, it's not a bad idea from a personal training perspective, dealing with non-athletes, so to speak, um, to understand intensity as the effort level. That helps you a lot. It really does. Because the average person, as Ace will tell you, irrespective, training intensity varies inversely with training volume. Here's the deal. You can use relatively lightweight, but if you take that individual doing bench presses and they are just completely fatigued at 14 or 15 reps, you're going to make them sore. They're going to get really sore. So you got to be careful um, with the total level of intensity. That's why understanding intensity in the second way, meaning just complete and total effort, all out effort, is probably a better way to deal with the average client. And so, and Ace will tell you that still got to be very careful when developing an exercise program. If they are new to muscular training, this is at the bottom. The initial program should feature exercises with a low level of intensity, right? That does not mean you're using heavy weights for lower repetitions because, again, we said you can measure intensity. It could be a very intense set if you're using 90% of the max one rep max. Even for one rep, that can make somebody pretty sore if they're not accustomed to training. So if you read through this one area, like I say, I think Ace did a pretty good job of explaining it. And keep in mind that when you're actually training people, it's intensity and volume. And they talk about that in periodization. Generally, as intensity goes up, the volume goes down, right? You don't want to cause an overtraining condition for your client. So I hope this was helpful. If it was, write the word understand in the comments section. We want to help you to pass your ACE exam. And one of the ways you do that is by actually understanding what they have in their textbook, and we're happy to assist you with that. If you think that there's a concept or an idea from the ACE textbook that would make a good video, or I can explain it to you a little bit more, go ahead and just let us know. Write that in the comments section below. As always, if you've got questions or need assistance, just let us know. Remember to subscribe to the channel. If you haven't done so, give us a thumbs up as well, and share the video if you would like as well. Have a great week. We will see you next week. Take care.